Well, hello, and welcome to the Headless with Cloudinary Bootcamp course lesson number 12, an intro to multipart forms and base64 encoding, presented by Erwin Lukas, Senior Solution Architect at Cloudinary. If you want to learn more about him, just watch the interview in the introduction section of his course on headlesscreator.com. With that said, let's go ahead and get Erwin in. Erwin, welcome. Glad to have you here. I'm going to let you get started, but before you do, I want to remind everybody watching live that you can type in questions in the chat, and I'll ask Erwin any questions you have. Erwin, it's all yours, sir.
Thank you, Marcelo. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining on these sessions. So today I'm going to talk about multipart forms and base64 encoding. In previous sessions, we've already covered different types of images, videos, and other type of media assets. But how can those files be accessed or uploaded to your backend server to be processed and delivered? In these sessions, I'll go over on how to transmit content from web page to your backend server with form data. So what's form element? It's an HTML element used to collect user inputs to be sent to the backend server. Form has many attributes, and one of them is enctype, which stands for encoded type. This will determine on how the data should be encoded. So the first one is plain text. The data are not encoded, so it's not considered safe. And I can show you what that means in a bit. The second one is URL encoded, which is a default value when it's not defined. The keys and values are encoded in key value tuples, and each pair is separated by ampersand with equal signs between the key and the value. So special characters are percent encoded. For example, a question mark will be encoded like to percent 3f. Last but not least, the multi-part form data. The data are segregated into multiple boundaries with user agent defined boundaries separating each part. The keys are given in the header of each part. Now we are aware of the difference between each encoded type. What does it look like exactly? Here are the sample code on how to define each encoded types with plain text, URL encoded, as well as multi-part form data. So let's take a look at the code. Here I already created a simple HTML with a few fields already defined in here. In the first one, I'll show about the plain text, and let's take a look at what's the UI look like in here. And at the same time, I'm going to start a simple command, which essentially just listening to port 8000 where the form will submit it to. And all it does is just spit out the output of the request. All right, so in here, I'm just going to pick a few files, a picture, as well as a text. Okay, and then I click submit. In the beginning, that's basically the request header look like. And then separated by an empty line, and then this is where the body of the payload. And you can see that on each field, you see the first name and the value, last name and the value. And for the file, as you can see, it's only the file name, but not the actual content of the file itself.
Quick question for you on this,
Yeah.
because is there any reason to really use plain text? Because it seems like, as we can see here by the headers and what's being transmitted, it is extremely unsafe, right? You don't want to pass a password for a login screen or anything like that with plain
Right.
text. What's a use case scenario to actually use plain text?
I think when your application is pretty simplistic, doesn't needs to be complicated. This is a good use case where it's just a simple a value or a hidden value also that can be useful. But for the most part, I don't think you want to pick this. I think this is one of the reasons it's not the default value.
Right.
So I
Maybe
would
an internal app that never hits the internet, right? Like internal within
exactly.
the enterprise.
Yes, exactly. So if for the most use case, it's either the second approach or even the third approach would be ideal for real world applications.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah. And this is where actually I'm going to show you also. Let's say I'm going to put a special character in here, equal sign, and let's say ampersand also, and to see what the data look like when I click submit. And as you can see, they are not encoded in any way. And this is very risky for input injections, that type of thing. And your application needs to be very aware of that. All right. On the second one, I'm going to show you on how to what it looks like with the URL encoded. Right. Same thing in here. I'm going to click and I'm just going to type that, for example, click picture, um, and then text, and then click submit. And as you can see now, you're probably familiar with this format, which is generally is in the URL as a query string or query parameters. Everything, every field is separated by ampersand here, here, and here. But this time, the special characters are percent encoded, like the equal signs becomes percent 3D. But the same thing, the file itself, it just contains a file name without actual content itself. So the last encoded type, which in this
Can I
case
ask
is,
you a real quick question on
yeah,
that as well,
of
on the
course.
encoded?
Mhm.
Again, even though it's encoded, right, it's still not safe because you can easily unencode it, and a hacker could, if they
Um,
wanted to. But
it's
why would you use the encoding? What's the use case for the encoding?
the encoding. It's actually relatively safe because you
Okay,
cannot inject. I mean, even though you inject a special characters, it will be encoded, right? So you cannot manipulate shifting the
I
value to
see.
something else, right?
Right.
Or
So if
introducing a
you're
new,
inserting
yeah.
some code to execute because it's going to be URL encoded, it'll be garbage basically. That code won't
Exactly.
run in the
Exactly.
backend.
Yeah. So this is a common use case if you have something simple that does not include a file. And it's also, I think, might be limited of like the size of it. I'm not actually not sure what would be the maximum file size on a maximum size of that.
Hmm.
But it is a limitation of a URL encoded. Whatever URL encoded limitations will apply in here as well.
I see. That makes sense. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Mhm. All right. So same in here. I'm just gonna put a special character in there, and then uh, a picture, and then as well as a text. And let's take a look at what the request look like. You see a lot more stuff going on in here, and I'm gonna go into that. So the request will be contains boundaries, multiple boundaries. Each boundary is each field essentially, and each field will have content disposition to show what would be the field name in here, first name, last name, and the value. And you can see that it's not actually encoded. It's fine in here because it's already separated by the boundaries. So the application, the backend server can assume that, hey, whatever raw value in this section, treat it as raw value. So don't manipulate it in any way. Don't treat it as key value, for example. So that way, applications already aware of that. And the big difference with the form data, you can see multi-part form data specifically, you can see that the content of the file itself, and this is the binary values that presented in the terminal here of that image. But on top of that, it does shows also the file name, the field name, and the content type. And if I scroll down, same thing with the text. I have inside my text, hello world. Same thing with the headers. It shows the field name, file name, and content type. So everything in here is separated by the user agent defined boundaries here. All right, so let's go back to the slide. So now we understand what the data look like when it's being transmitted from front end to back end. Let's see how we can upload a file with multi-part form data. So here are the code snippets using HTML versus JavaScript approach. In this example, I'll be using Cloudinary endpoint to upload a file just to make it easier to upload to backend server. So I have the same endpoint here in HTML as well as in JavaScript here. Let's go back to the code. So let me open the second example. Same thing to the previous example. The only thing I change is the endpoint into an actual backend server, and obviously the encoded type is a multi-part form data. And let's see what it looks like in the HTML page. Um, Upload preset just Cloudinary specific, just to make it easier to define the the type of uploads. So in this case, I'm using the unsigned upload. And I'm just going to pick a file, doesn't matter which one. And I'm going to click upload. And at this point, I think I can collapse the console here. All right, so Cloudinary upload API will return JSON payload, which in this case will return the characteristics about the image that just uploaded. That's including the URL of the uploaded image. I'm not going to go into detail on these sections, but I'll show you a little bit in the next example, which is the JavaScript version. So in the JavaScript version, it's similar, but instead of everything is defined in the form, instead of having the actions and the method in there, I'll have the onSubmit, and then I will call an upload in there, and then this is my upload functions. And you see something similar with the HTML version, where it has form data, which equivalent to that multi-part form data. And then on top of that, I will create a new XML HTTP request, or sometimes called XHR or AJAX. And then in there, I'll mention that, hey, open up an endpoint to this endpoint with a post method, and the response type is going to be JSON. And then in here is the functions where going to be executed when the response is received, which is just going to spit out the JSON, as well as display or previewing the image itself using the URL, the remote URL. So let's take a look at that page. So again, similar in there, I'm gonna click an image and click an upload. So this is a typical with modern website. Generally, you have this in the XHR or AJAX call, and then process it and then display it nicely on your web page. So in example, you see the preview there, and you see the payload of the JSON, which I'm using this URL to display that image. And you can see other characteristics also about that image, like the width, the height, the format, and other things that you might find it useful. All right, let's go back to the slides. All right. So when you're uploading, when your application needs to upload a large file, such as a Photoshop file or videos, there's some limitation needs to be considered. Your backend server will impose maximum size that it can handle per post request. So this limitation is imposed for performance and security reasons. With chunk upload, which by breaking the file into smaller pieces, is a common implementation to upload a large file. If you're using a popular service such as Cloudinary, usually there's an SDK or some sort of tool that they provide to make this process much simpler. As an example, Cloudinary have an SDK and upload widget as shown here to support all different kind of upload scenarios. So here's the code snippet on how to achieve chunk upload with JavaScript. So the main key here, without going into too much detail, is you may want to provide a unique upload ID, as is shown in here, to signify that all these chunks belong to a single file. So the backend server knows that by using that ID. In my example there, I'm using the timestamp of the upload ID, and all this function does is just looping through, slicing it up, and send it over to the backend server. And on the right side, that's the function to slice up the file. All right, so next, we are going to cover base64 encoding. Base64 is a group of binary to text encoding schemes that represents the binary data in a plain text format by translating it into a base64 representation. Here are the example on how you can convert from binary to base64 ASCII with B2A, which stands for binary to ASCII, or the other way around from base64 ASCII to binary with A2B. So what are the pros and cons using base64 encoded content? The pros, ASCII is very widely supported format, so almost every system, protocol, and or database support ASCII. With that, you can embed an image in HTML or CSS, since they are inherently an ASCII file, which can save on the HTTP overhead for lower latency. The cons, it produced roughly 33% larger file size than its binary counterpart. This can outweigh the benefit of HTTP request cost savings, especially for larger images. Um, when the base64 encoded image, so when are we going to use the base64 encoded? Since base64 is ASCII safe, as previously mentioned, it opens up flexibility for a system that does not support binary files. A few scenarios are embedding an image in an email, which I'm going to show what that looks like later on, embedding an image in HTML or CSS, as previously mentioned, embedding an image in JSON or XML, which also inherently are an ASCII files. And last but not least, I'm also going to show you on how to upload an image with base64 encoding. So let's go back to the code. And in here, I'll show you an email, which is signifies in here as .eml. I prepared that a simple email here. And you use this similar thing as the multipart form data, that you have boundaries in here. And one of the boundary in here is the embedded image. You see that the base64 data representing of that image. And of course, it tells the email client, in this case, it shows that, hey, the content type is PNG, this is the name, and then something similar in here. But what's important here is also the content ID. Basically, how do I gonna refer this image later on to display it on the email client, and how is this content is being encoded? In this case, it's base64. With rich email format, you can have some form of HTML. And in here, I have a few tags and I have an image source. And then this time, I'm referring the image with the content ID. And that's the ID, the same ID that I defined in here. And let's take a look at what that email looked like. So in here, as you can see, the image is there. It's embedded. It does not need to make another request to display that image, because that image is part of the email itself. All right, let's go back to the slides. All right, so in summary, here are the few key takeaways. So use multi-part form data when you need to upload files to the backend server. When you need to upload a large file, backend server will impose maximum file size per HTTP post request. So chunk upload is required to upload a large file. And use base64 encoding only when the image needs to be embedded, stored, or transmitted to an ASCII file format, such as email, HTML, and so on. And we also went over on how to upload files with HTML versus JavaScript, as well as uploading a binary versus base64 encoded ASCII. I hope everyone find this session insightful. Thank you very much.
It was really, really good, Erwin. Thank you so much. Now, quick question on embedding images in an email. Is this the best practice or standard is to embed images in email as base64 as you were showing, or what's the best practice around that?
The best practice on that is, if you want to embed an image on the email, is keep in mind is to keep it relatively small, because nowadays email is scrutinized, for security, that kind of thing. So
Right.
many popular email, including Gmail and Microsoft email, they limit that, they restrict that. I think one of them is file size of the overall email. So that embedded image is part of that overall email, right? So the common example is probably like a company logo as part of your signature. But if you have like a marketing email that's quite large, quite intensive, then it's probably still good to have a remote URL as the image,
Right.
because that will not increase the overall email size.
Because if you increase the overall, you have the potential of being rejected. That email has the potential of being
Exactly.
rejected.
I think what happens is the email client will truncate that email, and then it will mess up the look of the email itself.
Oh, that's interesting. You know, that kind of, I think in Gmail, I've had emails where it says it only shows part of it and you click here to see the rest and it opens up in the browser.
Yes, exactly. So I think it's like about 100K file
Got
size
it.
maximum. Yeah.
That
And they
makes a
keep
lot of
changing.
sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's
Yeah.
striking that balance, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, definitely. Erwin, thank you so much. If people want to get hold of you, that email is the best place.
Yes, that's my email address.
Yeah, and I know you're on LinkedIn as well, right? So they can look you
Right.
up there.
Yep, you can look me up with my name in there and on LinkedIn.
Erwin, you're a champ. I know you had a cold and you got through this. Perfect. So thank you so much and go rest now.
Thank you, Marcelo.
And thanks to the rest of you for watching. And remember to continue your journey learning all about digital asset management systems by watching the next lesson. Also, remember you can get your knowledge certification by studying the study guide, by using or reading the study guide for this lesson, which you can find in the bonus section of this course. And as always, you can get a hold of me right there, marcelo@headlesscreator.com. We got a couple more lessons coming for you, so stay tuned for those, and we will see you on the next ones. Cheers.